Hi, Anthony and Bob Barker here, and today we're going to be tackling some kitchen remodeling projects, and we're going to start off with making these shaker doors. So we're going to go over two different ways that you can make these doors and drawer faces. So let's get to it. Okay, so this is the doors that our kitchen had when we first started. They're not the worst one in the world, but the wife really didn't like the design, and those drawer faces always really bugged me. We didn't want to change the layout, so I decided just to basically just resurface them, and Bob Barker agrees. So the basic components of the shaker doors is you got 5 different pieces. You got the top and the bottom, which go horizontal, and those are the rails, and most people remember them because it's kind of like the rails of a railroad track. And then on the 2 side pieces that go vertically, those are the stiles, and then you have the middle panel. And the only difference between the doors and the drawer faces is that middle panel is thicker on the drawers, but we'll go over that in a little bit. So to get started, we're going to cut down the rails and stiles to the thickness that we need. I got some hard maple for this one. I prefer that over poplar just because in the kitchen area they're more prone to getting hit, so this is going to be much more resistant to dings and dents. So we're ripping down our pieces here, and for the majority of the pieces I'm going to go 2 1/4 inches. I just kind of found that that's the size that looks right to me. All of my cabinet doors will be 2 1/4 for the rails and the stiles. However, for some of the drawers that are a little bit more squinched together, I went 2 1/4 for the stiles, but I went 1 1/4 for the rails, just so it has a little bit of a more open area in the middle for the drawer pull, and it didn't look so crunched down. And as I'm cutting these to size, I usually cut off the very edge first, just so it's a nice smooth surface, and then I start cutting the actual dimensions that I want. And I'm using my miter station here, and I set up my stop block over there so I can get nice even cuts across. Now with the pieces cut out, we can get into actually making the shaker doors. So the first method we're going to do is basically using a dado stack on the table saw. And to be honest, if you don't have the capability to put a dado stack on your table saw, I would probably go for the second method anyways, just because this can get very tedious if you're just using a single blade to make all these cuts. Especially if you're making as many doors and drawer faces as I did, which was 40 of them. So we're using just the outer 2 blades of the dado stack, which is about 1/4 inch, because we are doing a 1/4 inch panel for the doors. So we get that on, and I take off my riving knife because you can't use that with the dado stack, and then we can get started. So you set the depth that you're looking for, and then for these, you just want to basically center it right in the middle. And then after you get it all set up, you just run it straight through, and then you got your groove there that's going to accept your panel. Now it's okay if you're not exactly dead center, as long as you mark it, which is the front and back, and keep them all the same. That way any offset will be the same on all of the pieces. So for the stiles, you only need that one center dado groove. But for the rails, you're going to need that dado groove, but you're also going to need to cut out the edges of these to make the tenon that will connect with the other pieces. So I'm marking here how much I need to cut off, and that's just the exact same depth as the dado groove that you already placed. And for the ones that I made, those are about 7/16 of an inch deep. So here shows one of the reasons why I only put 1 miter bar on my crosscut sled, because now I can move over to this track and I can use the dado stack off the edge. So I'm using the stop block to set up the rail here, and I'm going to use the dado stack to cut out the tenon on this. And you can just use a wider dado stack and do this all in one cut. And you want to raise the blade just a little bit at a time, just till you get right at the exact thickness, just to cut off the final edge of that piece right there. And then I'm setting the shoulder there on each side, and you want to make sure you stay on the same side of the wood, just in case your groove's not directly in the middle, because then the depth of this cut might be different on the opposite side of the piece. And then after we get that first cut, we just go ahead and finish them up. And then you'll repeat this on all the rails on the same side. So if it's the front surface, you do all the front surfaces. That way you have nice and even cuts before you switch it to the back surface. And then also, depending on your stop block, you also need to be careful which side you do first. That way you don't lose your registration, as you see here. But since this one slides out, it doesn't really matter. And just like we did on the other side, we're going to get this in place the proper way, and then we're going to sneak up on the cut again till we get just past that tongue into the dado groove that we're looking for, and you don't want to go too much further, otherwise it's just not going to sit in there nice and tight. And I also wanted to mention, if you're doing this method, using a flat curved blade will get you a much nicer cut, and you won't have those little ridges that you'll have with the typical blades. So it'll be nice and smooth in there. So now that we got that rail cut out, we can just kind of put them nice and together. And if you got your cuts right, it should fit together nice and tight, and you can kind of wiggle it around and it'll stay in place. So this is a nice way to go, but honestly, it's not my preferred method. I like the router bits a little bit better, so I bought these for this project. And one of the things I liked about these ones is they're very adjustable, so they have little spacers you can see up top on both of those, so you can adjust the widths that you're doing of the dado grooves. So that'll help you deal with any size of middle panel that you want to do. You can fine tune your bits to compensate for whatever size you end up with. So all we do is we get this into our router table, which is one of the main reasons why I made this router table, because I knew I was going to be doing a ton of these doors. And we use this straight edge there to adjust the fence so the wood will slide straight perfectly along the fence and then right on the bearing in the middle of this. And then I also just took a scrap piece of wood and made a perfect square out of it with my crosscut sled, so I know they're all 90 degrees, and I'm using that as a push block on these rails. That way it's much easier to get these cut out. And as you can see, they just go nice and fast. So after you get those cut out on all of your pieces, then you just want to cut out that center piece, and basically you just put the bit in there, and I used a test piece first to adjust it so it's perfectly in line with that tenon on there. So then all the grooves and everything line up perfectly. And just like in the other method, you want to label which one is going to be the front and the back of your pieces. That way you can just keep everything aligned properly and everything will fit together better, just in case you didn't get your groove dead center on the piece of wood. And it especially was important for me because I didn't realize that not all of my pieces of wood were the same exact thickness, so that created some issues for me later. And I was about halfway through this before somebody actually gave me a planer, which helped me kind of fix that issue and saved me from a ton of sanding. So with my router table going, it actually went pretty quick, and I got all these pieces done in not that long of a time. So next up is just to cut out the pieces for the panels, and essentially you're just measuring the middle pieces and just accounting for all of the grooves in there. So you just add a little bit extra on each one. And I'm doing a 1/4 inch MDF for the doors, and I'm doing 1/2 inch MDF for the drawers. And then what I do with the drawers here is I used a straight bit to also cut off like a rabbet all the way around it. And that way, once you do it, you're going to have a lip that fits into your grooves, but then you're going to see the part that'll stay flush with the back of the door. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit later as well. Okay, now that we got our pieces cut out, it's time to get them glued up. But before you do that, I think it's really good just to kind of sand this inner surface where the panel's going to go, because otherwise, if you have this surface on, it gets a little bit more tricky to get this a nice clean edge. So I would definitely recommend at least sanding this down before you put it together. There's multiple ways to do it. You can just use a regular sander, go across the top. You can use a belt sander, ride this on it. Or for some of the smaller pieces, I just glued this together. I put different grits of sandpaper, and then you can kind of just rub it on through each one of them and get it nice and smooth. And then I usually kind of hit this inner part too, so it's a good transition there. All right, and then these two will show you the difference between the cabinet door with this, just the 1/4 inch piece, and the ones at the drawer face that has the 1/2 inch piece with the lip here. Now, since these are MDF, you don't really have to worry about like the wood movement or expansion. So you can actually glue these into place if you like. You don't really have to. As long as you get these edges nice and tight, it's going to sit either way. So let's get this one started. And I would definitely recommend to mark all these pieces and do a dry fit first to make sure everything goes together the way you want, and that way you remember which pieces fit well where. Just slip it into place, and then I always like to make sure I get this nice and lined up. I like to keep that mallet handy just in case any of these pieces need a little extra persuasion to go into place. And I also like to assemble these lifted off of the table a little bit, so that's why I have those pieces of wood there. It just helps things kind of sit a little nicer. Check it for square. Unfortunately, I don't have clamps that are a little bit smaller, so I got to use my big ones for this. And watch for any movement as you clamp it. You got to be especially careful with that, because if you clamp it too hard or if you clamp it in an odd direction, it can kind of create an angle in the wood, and that's going to mess up the whole door or drawer a little bit. And honestly, you can probably even get away without clamping it. As long as your wood slides together really nicely, it's not going to move anywhere. Now this shows the difference between the two. So this is one of just the cabinet doors glued up, and so you got the front piece. The back piece, it looks pretty much identical. It's got kind of this set in. With the drawer faces, the front part has the inset part of the shaker door, but the back part is nice and flush. And the reason why you want it like this is because when you're attaching it to the drawer face, you don't want this inset. It's going to put this undue pressure on this when you're trying to put in your hardware there. And it might not sit right depending on your drawer size as well. So a nice flush surface will make it go in much easier. And this kind of shows the joints, as well as you can see how I labeled everything extensively to make sure I put it right where it needed to be. And Bob Barker was inspecting everything as we went. Next is some caulking. So I took the piece and I kind of used a knife to cut that little edge in there so it fits in the corners well. This just makes sure that you don't see any little gaps after you paint it up. And I like to use that tool just to kind of spread it and get rid of any excess so it's nice and smooth edge. And Bob Barker was right on top of me, making sure I was doing a good job when I was doing this part. He is a very, very thorough supervisor. And like I mentioned earlier, some of these woods were a little bit different thicknesses, so I had to sand them down. I used the belt sander just to kind of get these edges a little bit better. And I also put in some wood filler there too as well. And it came out really nicely in the end. But you really got to watch what you're wearing when you do this. This kind of happened to me. Now, I actually have lost a lot of weight in the last year or two. So I was wearing one of my old shirts that was super loose, and it just got caught in there. And luckily, I stopped it before it did any damage. But be careful with what you're wearing in the shop. So after I got that done, then I went over everything a few more times with the sander to get it all nice and smooth. And of course I made sure to hit all those edges. And I also used the sander on the outside edges of those little corners just to soften those up a little bit. So it's not such a harsh edge that you're going to dent easily, and it'll hold the paint a little nicer too. And since it can't do it so much on the inside ones, I did all those ones by hand again. So then the next step was to set up for the hinges, and I bought this Craig jig, which worked out really well. And it's so simple to use. Essentially, you just clamp it in place, and then they have this Forstner bit inside of it with a stop already set on there. And then on the jig itself, it has two holes for the screws, so you just put a little screw through each one of those, and that's it. So then you just do your two hinges on each side, and then you're good to go. Now, I did have 40 doors and drawers total to make, so this did create quite a mess. So we were going from the regular hinges to the concealed hinges on this one. So we're getting ours ready, and I'm going to go ahead and get them all in position here. So I got them all laid out, and I measure very carefully where I want the bottom hinge to go. So then I just hold that in place, and I use a self-centering bit to drill the holes, and then I just screw that hinge in place, and then I can go ahead and just attach the door to that one. And then with the top hinge, I hold it in place there, and then I just use the centering drill bit again, and it gets it right in place. So I only have to measure on the bottom one, and the top one is just kind of naturally going to fall in place, and then we can test them all out. So I just repeated this a whole bunch of times. And of course, the nice thing with these is they're fully adjustable, so you can get it nice and lined up well once you get everything in place. And for the bigger doors, I put 3 hinges on those. So next up was the drawer pulls, and the wife decided this is the one she wanted. So basically, I just centered them on there and found out exactly where I wanted them. And then I made this jig that's kind of reversible, and that way I can drill the holes in all of the different ones pretty quickly. So I just basically just hold it into place, and those 2 extra pieces on the sides of it will get it lined up perfectly, and then I can just repeat this process a few more times, and then I get all the drawers ready for the pulls. And I put this piece of tape on there just to make sure I drilled in the right spots, just to remind myself exactly where the drawer pull is supposed to be on each door. And for the drawer faces, I just made this little separate jig and I put those on another piece. And of course, with the cabinet doors and this one, you always want to make sure you have a backer piece as you're drilling through. That way you don't create any blowout. Especially once you got this far, you don't want to create more work for yourself trying to fix things. So like I mentioned before, I had the external hinges, so I'm just putting some glue and toothpicks and snapping them off in there just to fill up those holes. And then afterwards, I got this epoxy putty and just kind of mix that up together. Once you kind of smash it all over, then it gives you about 10 minutes to work time. That sets really nicely, and that's nice and solid. And then later on, we'll come back and sand that down so you'll never see those holes or the little dents from the prior hinges. Now it's time to get them painted, so I labeled everything and I put a little tape to cover it. And we're going to just use some primer first. And then with the HVLP gun that I just got, it needs to be thinned with this type of primer. So I'm using these cups just to kind of get it nice and measured out. And then some water, just regular old tap water to get it thinned out some and mix it up real good. And then we can go ahead and pour it through the filter and it's ready to go. And I'm kind of rushing through the painting process a little bit here. And that's the HVLP gun that I'm using, but can go over it in more detail in future videos if you guys are interested in that. So once I got my paint ready to go, I also had my setup as well. So I just got a tent and I put a fan with a filter in the back of it, just to get a little extra ventilation. And I made a Lazy Susan with some scrap wood. And then I just put it on top of there and then I can go to town with the painting. And we started off with the primer with the bare wood, and then we did a sanding afterwards just to kind of get all those grains nice and smooth again, because the moisture in there kind of raises the grain on that initial bare wood. And then after we finished that one, then we went back and put a couple coats of a urethane enamel on top of it. And the tent worked out great for the priming, and I actually did this a little bit at a time, so I didn't do it all the same day, so it worked out good. And Bob Barker made sure that I wasn't lonely during that process as well. But for the finished painting, we ended up setting up a room in the entire garage, and I had a particularly busy stretch at work, and I wanted to get it done, so I ended up getting some help to finish these up. But I will go over my finished painting process on a future video where I'm going to be showing a built-in. So here's the final product, the doors on and everything nice and painted, and all the new hinges and hardware. And that's it. So I'm very happy with how these came out. I think they look great, and more importantly, Bob Barker approves. So if you guys like what we're doing, feel free to subscribe or just leave a comment below telling us what you think about our projects, and we'll see you guys in the next one.